Hey, what's up, everyone? Welcome back to Permission to Shine podcast, where I, your host, Andrew Nemani, gets to highlight some of the most incredible, inspiring, humble people from across the globe. Today, we've got Karenna Gore, the founder and executive director of the Center for Earth Ethics, also happens to be the daughter of Vice President Al Gore. She drops some incredible knowledge pertaining to faith, ecology, and ethics, and I cannot wait for you guys to hear this incredibly insightful conversation. There's so much tangible advice. It's so good. I'm coming to you guys from Washington, D.C. Got some meetings here this week celebrating my sister and mom's birthdays, two of the most badass women in the world and two people who I consider to be my idols. So happy birthday to you, mom and sis. The NATO summit is also happening. So there's like 30 some, nation leaders here. I was just at Maman, the famous East Coast cafe. It's where Oprah's favorite cookie is. So if you haven't been to Maman, check it out, Maman. And there was like 5 Secret Service members like surrounding me. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? And I look to my right and it's this guy who's obviously being guarded. And I'm like, who is it? It turns out he was the Prime Minister of Greece. Kind of tried to talk to him, would have loved to get him on the podcast, but his security detail was not having it. I ended up talking to them for a while, figuring out who he was. And they wouldn't give me to him, but they did offer me a job. So if I disappear from the podcast, it's because I'm working for the Secret Service. Jokes. I'm not leaving you guys. I love this way too much. Talking about podcast guests, where we've now done 36 of these. And somebody last weekend over the 4th of July challenged me to come up with my biggest takeaways from all of the people that I've been fortunate to spend time with through the podcast. So I put together a list, and I want to share one in the intros for the coming weeks. The one I've been thinking about lately is how the podcast guests surround themselves with, and in many cases, hire people who are much better than them. And I feel like I have that in my life in every single way. I'm constantly not the smartest person in the room, the fittest person. I'm constantly getting humbled by the people I'm around. And I love that. I feel so lucky for it. It's not easy in the moment because you're like, dude, why can't I just win at something? It never happens, it feels like. But at least you're always getting better. And I think that journey is extremely worth it. A bit more on Karenna Gore, and then we're going to get into the story. She's a graduate of Harvard. She got her law degree from Columbia, and then she got a master's from the Union Theological Seminary in New York City, which is an off branch of Columbia. She's a professor there now. This is really interesting. In 2014, she hosted the Religions for the Earth conference, where she brought together 200 of the top religion leaders across the globe. And what she realized is that they needed a central system to work together. And that's when she started the Center for Earth Ethics, which focuses on faith, ethics, and ecology. And guys, she's going to give us so much tangible advice on how we can unite together to do what's right for the environment. She's also going to drop some cool stories growing up with Al Gore being her father. So without further ado, if you've got feedback, if you've got comments, I would love hearing from you guys. You guys have been reached out a bunch lately. I love it. Reach out, Andrew at permissiontoshine.org. Andrew at permissiontoshine.org. I love you all. Thank you for trusting me with your time. Please enjoy this conversation with Karenna Gore.
You got arrested.
Yes, that's right.
The news loved that. Former vice president daughter gets arrested.
Yeah. So that was in 2016 in West Roxbury, which is part of Boston, Massachusetts. And that was a fracked gas pipeline. So there was a huge amount of expansion of fracked gas pipelines. And this one was one that the whole community was against. The city of Boston was suing to stop it. All the elected officials were against it. But it was really this pattern that's happened whereby there's a kind of alliance between the corporations that have a lot of power and want to make money and the aspects within government systems, including the kind of regulatory state, in this case the FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and they just get approved and kind of rubber stamped. And so this was an action that was calling attention both to the fact that we need to stop the build out of fossil fuels, but it was also about democracy and self-government and how it's not right that corporate rights can come over community rights. So yes, I was part of that action, and that was a nonviolent civil disobedience arrest, and we ended up going through the goal. And I should acknowledge that Tim DeChristopher was sort of the person who had the main idea for this particular action. Marla Markham, the Climate Disobedience Center was sort of training and doing this, and it was very intentional with the goal to have a trial actually, and present the necessity defense so that there could be the use of a public forum like a jury trial to air information about why this
Put a
feels
spotlight.
yeah, exactly. Why this feels necessary at this point for people to, because it's been the harm of climate change is greater than the harm of blocking pipeline construction for a few days, and the or trespassing.
Were you nervous?
I was very. That was the prevailing a little bit, yes, but that with the prevailing sentiment was, I guess, I felt so worried about the climate crisis, so kind of what feels it feels crazy for many people. What is crazy is to act like nothing's wrong, and just go about like things are normal. That's what feels extreme and crazy. So it kind of it counterbalances it to be like it's something that you can do that's like commensurate with that type of feeling, so that you can demonstrate this is how strongly that I feel about how crazy it is to act like nothing's going on. The nerves were not the main emotion. It was more like, okay, there's
has to be
something that
done.
I can do. I understand that, it's not for everybody. There are different ways, that you can go about this. But at that moment, that felt right to be a part of that group doing that. And then, of course, when Standing Rock happened, was around the same time, the Standing Rock Sioux standing up to the Dakota Access Pipeline, doing that prayer camp, and really reframing the resistance to fossil fuel infrastructure as being protectors instead of protesters, where water protectors was the language that they were using, and defend the sacred was the banner that they marched behind, and it was water is life, and uh, that kind of language, and that kind of was very inspiring for many of us, and so that was kind of in the air.
You started the Religions for the Earth conference, correct?
Yes, I planned that conference, and it was in September 2014 with some other people. I was one of the planners.
And you brought together 200 religious and spiritual leaders of different walks of life, you could say.
That's right, from all over the world. So it was really pegged to the climate summit that the United Nations had in that year, in the fall of 2014. And the Secretary General then was Ban Ki-moon. And it was a time in which there was, if you can imagine, even more sort of despair, or a certain kind of despair, about our ability to really confront and deal with the climate crisis, because it was before the Paris Agreement. It was after some of the meetings like in Copenhagen, where there had been no real agreement or progress of any kind. And so this climate summit in September 2014, it was also the year, if any of your listeners recall, of the People's Climate March, which was a very big one in New York City that year. There was a call to engage civil society more, the idea being that really this isn't going to be solved by politicians and governments alone. This was a gathering, Religions for the Earth, in which we were very deliberately putting the focus on faith-based and spiritual and religious, or other words, faith, spirituality, and religion. And so we invited these leaders from all around the world. And as you said, there were about 200, and it was to reframe climate change as a moral issue and galvanize faith-based action to confront it.
That's so impressive. I think as somebody who's kind of traveled the world, I grew up Catholic, but then studied Buddhism recently in Nepal and Bhutan, just got back from that trip. And it's like we all kind of believe in the same thing at its core, but like, how can we just get together? But for so many, years, we've all fought over it. So I'm so impressed that you could bring these people together. And I'm curious how you kind of thought about bringing them together and getting them to see eye to eye on such an important issue.
It's interesting. There's a whole tradition and field of interreligious dialogue that people become good at as they do it over and over on various issues. And it's important to think about diversity within a religious field. There are a little bit of different factors. So you can have an interreligious dialogue with Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. And there's certainly, you talk about there's been a lot of conflict in religion, and certainly between the three of them, there's quite a lot. And just to sort of bring people together in that way, in interreligious dialogue is itself, of course, such a worthy endeavor. But when it comes to the issue of nature, how human societies relate to nature, it's especially important to see that those three religions actually have more in common. They call them the Abrahamic faiths, or the people of the book, um, than those from Indic traditions like Hinduism and Sikh and others, and East Asian and Shinto and Buddhism, and also indigenous traditions, which oftentimes weren't included in interreligious dialogue at all, for some complex reasons, including that it is distinct, in many indigenous peoples more identify it as a culture or a way of life than a religion, and the whole category of religion is kind of a Western, European construct in a way that doesn't necessarily apply. But in this case, when talking about prayers and ceremonies and traditions, the indigenous spiritualities were really important. And so that became quite central, to the Religions for the Earth conference, to sort of lift up that voice. And then, in terms of your question about seeing eye to eye, it is true that there's so much in common about, sort of seeing, um, through the lens of meaning and a longer term view. So ancestors and future generations are already, concepts in most traditions that are very present, and also seeing that, life is more than politics or price tags could ever, reflect. In terms of protecting, this interconnected web of life on Earth, and you could say nature, there is a lot of seeing eye to eye. And then the differences are also quite interesting, actually. So that if you think about, religious traditions that believe in reincarnation, it's a different conversation about future generations, than with those that believe in an afterlife, or a heaven and a hell, for that matter. And those conversations, if they're done really respectfully, can tease out some very interesting things.
That's beautifully said. Did you grow up religious, spiritual?
I did. I grew up going to church every Sunday,
Where
and
was this at?
well, so I was going between, Washington D.C. and really suburban Washington D.C., so Northern Virginia. But my father was representing Tennessee in the government, and particularly Middle Tennessee. So we were back and forth. But I did go, consistently, as a child, and I also was interested in it always, so that, as I grew older and had friends from different traditions, I always found it very interesting to see how people did those ceremonies and services, and, found myself much later in life going to seminary, where I learned even more. So
And you'd say that that's continued to evolve? Has it kind of on the same track, or has it kind of changed tracks?
well, it certainly changed tracks. I grew up going to church, and kind of understanding that something was going on. The church in Tennessee that I went to, I have to say, was very small, and very, much a place that people brought things super authentically. So there was a lot of, carrying, uh, grief or concern for relatives, to be shared communally with others and lifted up. And I just could see that that was emotionally meaningful. It wasn't the kind of church where people just went to go see and be seen, and, kind of check off the list.
To
It
go meet
was
their girlfriend or something, like some of my
something like
friends
that.
do. I'm
Yeah,
coming
well,
for
I
you
think
guys.
they've been community centers, in this country, more so in the past than they are today. And that's one of the things that I think is very interesting about religion in general, is that it's still a place where people share music, make music together, as opposed to, just buying it digitally online to listen to whatever's being, sold to you. It's a space in where people will share food, and, it's you don't get charged admission. I mean, there's often an offering plate, but it's
You're
these are
welcomed.
these are interesting spaces. And so I think that it's important, just in general, to kind of also, when we're dealing with the climate crisis and the ecological crisis, to understand that, um, these are places that are generally not just churches. We're talking about synagogues and temples and ashrams, and there are many different religious traditions in this country, where people come together, usually around shared values, and usually in physical places. And so there's a reach to that in terms of doing work on issues that we care about from a values perspective. And so part of what we do at the Center for Earth Ethics is to do trainings for faith leaders who are interested in doing more work around climate and environmental justice, and do talk about the science and the policy aspects of it, but also talk about things like ritual and ceremony and sacred text and teachings, and so on. And so it's really interesting work.
When was the moment, if you can remember, that you realized you were going to start the Center for Earth Ethics?
It was shortly after the Religions for the Earth ceremony.
That went well?
I mean, conference. It went very well, and it was after that that I had gotten a degree from Union Seminary, and then I was doing work on Religions for the Earth. It was part of being director of Union Forum, so I was convening things for Union Seminary.
Can you explain real quick what Union is?
So Union is a graduate school of religion. It is almost 200 years old. It was originally Presbyterian, then it became non-denominationally Christian, and now it's largely interfaith. It still has Christian roots. It's also, but there's a professor, there's a Buddhist studies program, there's a professor of Islam, Jewish theological seminaries across the street, and there's a very intentional work with other religious traditions. So there's an interfaith sort of legacy there. It's also a place that has been very active in movements for social change. So, for example, abolitionism and civil rights movement, very big there. There was James Cone was there, the father of Black liberation theology. It's very much a place in which people go out to do things in the world. And that has traditionally been work on human rights, on anti-racist work, and LGBTQ inclusion. There's a lot of people at Union who are really working for those movements.
That's amazing.
And seeing faith in the context of how it acts in the world.
It's amazing. It's so interesting. I mean, you went to Harvard, Columbia, and then Union. I think that's such a cool trio you have going on.
And I have to say I've learned so much from people outside of these academic institutions as well, just from being able to do the work in the movement way.
I went to Iowa, so thank you for saying that.
Yeah, well, for sure. No, this whole thing of sort of brand name elitist institutions is definitely, we know there's something wrong with it, right? I don't think it's the right way to measure the value in terms of where you can learn, particularly in this day and age. But I am grateful for what I've been able to learn there. But I have to say, in this movement, and part of what informs the work of the Center for Earth Ethics, it's environmental justice communities, it's indigenous communities that have really brought these ideas to the forefront that it owes nothing to the academy, really. When you look at the power of traditional ecological knowledge that's been kept in communities for years, now there's a lot more interest from academia in knowing what that is. And so I think we need to think about these bodies of knowledge a little bit differently. It's one of the things that I really enjoy doing at the Center for Earth Ethics.
Yeah. When you started it in 2015, what was your vision?
My vision was really almost like not coming from me in particular, but really feeling the call because of being at the right time and place, to create space to look at the root causes of this crisis, as opposed to only operating on the level of effects. So a lot of times with the climate crisis, the conversation is about, what's politically feasible to do versus what is actually required, or to look at the root causes deeper. You go to belief systems, to thought systems, as opposed to just talking about how can we get political spin to be correct to have people believe in climate change. That conversation obviously has to be had, but it kind of doesn't go to the deeper levels. So it was basically to explore the moral and spiritual dimensions of the ecological crisis, which includes the climate crisis, of course, and to be to be able to do so in an interreligious way, but also to distill ethics so that it can bridge to the secular world and be part of that larger conversational shift.
Talk about the climate crisis. How bad is it?
It's very severe and urgent, the climate crisis, as far as I can tell, as somebody who has taken time to kind of pay attention as much as possible to um, the reports that come out from scientists, as well as from the firsthand experience of people that are currently having these stronger storms, these heat waves, these droughts, these wildfires, the effects, the sea level rise that comes from the ice melt at the poles. It's all happening, and so it is urgent that we do something about it, and we can do something about it. So it's bad in the sense of the effects are here and they will get much worse if we don't do anything. But it's also, I don't know if the right word is good, but it's good that we can change, and that we have the technologies available to us now, to make the shift to the energy transition to clean, renewable energy, to stop the emissions. And that if we do that, it's not as if everything is all lost anyway. There's nothing we can do. It will make a difference, according to common sense, but also according to a lot of the most current scientific studies. That if we were to go to net zero emissions, then that there is a chance that we can halt the warming relatively soon, in a few decades, according to recent studies, as I have learned. So I think that we also need to focus on how this is a chance to make things even better in many other ways, because the same thing that's the main driver of the climate crisis, which is the burning of fossil fuels, also causes this local air pollution that harms people's health. Millions die around the world every year from this air pollution. So if we make that transition to clean energy, that also will eliminate the people that are suffering and dying from the effects of that particulate matter, soot, and so on, from that pollution. And there are other ways in which we can, even just the reconnection to nature that can happen through the ecological restoration work, is good for people's health, because we know that physical, mental, emotional health benefits from time in nature. And again, sometimes I don't know that we need studies to prove some of this, because we all know
go
it.
Get out there and feel it.
There you go. So, but there's a severity and an urgency that can feel really bad to this, but there's also, when you look at the flip side, such a great opportunity.
Talking about kind of the solution to this, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that we don't keep having these floods and these fires and the air pollution. There's myself, who's not in the environmental industry but cares about it. How can I help? How can I join the movement to make sure that we don't continue down this dangerous path?
One thing is, you can break the isolation if you want, and join up with people that are doing good work. And that way you get a steady flow of information about whatever, about the range of issues over which we have control, in terms of being, obviously you can make consumer choices that are more aligned with ecological values. You can vote and engage in the political system in order to change that at a systemic level, which I think is the most important thing. And then you can talk with other people about it, and start to kind of just change the consciousness, which will help. So if you're in New York City, there's the Environmental Justice Alliance. There's We Act up where we're based, up in West Harlem, Environmental Action. You can sign up for the Center for Earth Ethics newsletter.
Yes, do that.
For the We Act newsletter. There's the Climate Reality Project, which we work with quite a bit, which does trainings all over the world. I think it's the best because there are just a lot of people that are working pretty hard to kind of filter, distill the best solutions and get people going, that you might as well plug into. And you can do a range of organizations and see how they have different approaches. But I think that's the best way.
There's a person, I feel lucky to have my sister in the studio today from DC, and she's basically committing her career to this, right? She's an environmental engineer, undergrad, just got environmental policy, master's from Georgetown. And she's, all of her heart is in this since she was little, that I can remember. And it's always been very inspiring to our entire family. I think there's times she's very hopeful, and there's other times where it's very taxing and very heavy on her. And so for people like my sister Katie, how do they remain hopeful in the work and in the fight that they're doing?
I really feel that the way in which people are feeling discomfort is itself hopeful, because
Mm.
the problem has been really apathy. I mean, the problem has been, are we just sort of, as a human species, are we just sort of not smart enough, not collectively, you know, cognizant something's missing, so that we're not going to understand this and turn this around before it's too late, in terms of, the emissions getting to a certain point where there's a tipping point, and so on. So the fact that people more is more anxiety, and there are other problems that people are sensing in terms of um climate grief, and sort of more awareness of the environmental injustice issues, is itself hopeful, because it's a waking up. So I think, I'm not sure if that's too complicated an answer, but I actually see hope in the anxieties. um and the thing is to transform that, and make it so that when we come together, it breaks the isolation of it, and we can move forward. I think it's hopeful that more people are paying attention.
Is there a culture or a country that you've really gravitated to?
Indigenous cultures have really been the thing I've gravitated
Why
to
is
in the
that?
last few years, because I think it is okay. So the doorway that I went through is the spirituality religion doorway, right? For Because I was at Union Seminary, and I was aware of climate change and the climate crisis for my whole life, pretty much because my father had worked on it, and
He was
I
ahead
had
of his
been
time.
around that work.
Thank you to him for,
Oh,
yeah, paving a
thank you
path,
for
right?
thank you for acknowledging him. And so so I had been around it, but I hadn't seen my particular, role in the movement in that way. And so if you start from the place of, like, what does religion or faith have to do with climate change, you end up thinking about the relationship to nature, and how do we think about land and water and other living beings. Why is it that there is this sense that that many people sort of were acclimated to, or grew up with, were acculturated to, that this is all a set of resources that, human beings are here to dominate and extract and exploit. That basically it's about the economy, and that nature is either property, or it's to be taken to be resources for the economy. And when you start to think, well, that's a mindset, and there are other ways and cultures that don't actually think that way. And then if you encounter traditional indigenous peoples for whom there are prayers and ceremonies that really acknowledge the water, that acknowledge the land, that see, the in the Lakota Sioux language, Matake Yasin, all my relations. If you start to experience that culture, is powerful. And so I think that, and it's place based. So, indigenous cultures, in it, there are different ways to think about that, but it's particularly powerful when you're talking about an indigenous peoples that's in the place that is their ancestral homeland, and have been for a long time, because the relationships are so deep. And part of what I think has happened in terms of the levels, the scale, and the pace of ecological destruction that has occurred, in certainly in my lifetime, but in sort of that modern time, is a lot because of, I think, people moving from, I mean, you can say white settler colonialism, white settler colonialism. I know that's kind of like a trigger word that means different things to different people. I think there's a lot to it, because I think people came to a place without respecting the people that were there, without respecting those people that came and, were enslaved as labor either, and the mentality towards the natural world was very violent. So I think we're sort of unraveling some of that mentality as we do this work, to be more respectful of the peoples that have been dehumanized, that have been treated in that way, but also to understand that the land and the water and the tree, the forest, the life under the water is all, it's not just objects to exploit. There actually can be seen as relatives, and related to in a respectful way, and sort of try to restore balance. So I don't know if that articulates it as well as I had hoped, but that's some of what draws me to and makes me respect the indigenous traditions so much.
Thank you. I find this so interesting, Karenna.
In this day and age, there's a lot of stress involved in the information revolution. Gosh, we all know that.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm
Um,
helping or hurting.
no, this is great. No, you're any positive energy is helping. But one of the good things is that you can really find and learn a lot, right? If you want to, including watching little mini documentaries or finding voices from other sides of the world that are sharing things from these other places. And so earth ethics is an incredible field to be in that regard. There's so much going on and so much available.
Well, kudos to you. As we wrap this up and look forward to the future, where's the current gap and need in your eyes, Karenna?
One thing that's really important is to think about the role that culture and social norms play. Ethics is basically the distinction between right and wrong, and the implications for our behavior as individuals and as collectives. And so ethics obviously undergirds a lot of society, and including laws and social norms, but it's most powerful when a deeply felt sense of right and more widely shared sense of right and wrong is out of step with both laws and social norms. And so that's the case with the climate crisis today. Most of what's causing ecological destruction is perfectly legal and even socially encouraged. And so, one of the things that we need to do is change, as in the civil rights movement, for example. I mean, obviously, there are other ones. There's the women's suffrage movement. There's LGBTQ. There's abolition of slavery. Where the laws and the social norms were all upholding something incredibly wrong, and the movement to change it had to draw from ethics. So we're there in terms of the climate crisis. So we have to look at where those laws need to change. But I think when you ask what's missing, there's a lot of work being done on the laws and policies as well. There should be. Social norms are tougher. It's really we don't want to have a heavy-handed, nagging way of changing the way that other people behave, but we do want to build cultures of care more, and cultures that are in balance with nature. So I think that it doesn't necessarily need to be a new institution or a new organization, but just to try to start to think a little bit differently, like about relating to if you can be outside in your classroom space, like if we can turn education inside out a little bit and start to learn more about, like, where does our water come from, where does our waste go, what when we turn the light switch on, where is that coming from, and make it interesting and fun to sort of open up worlds of relationality, grow our food, our clothing, to be involved in, not in a stressful way, but in a sort of opening up of creativity and knowledge and coming together way, to change it to more of a culture of interrelationship and care and co-creation. I think is one of the things that's a big opportunity.
Well, Karenna, thank you for the education. Thank you for bringing us joy today and to the
Thank
listener, and just a,
you.
a pathway of hope, right? I think you painted the picture for us pretty clearly of what's going on and why we need to care, and you're giving us a vehicle to do something about it. And so thank you for the important work that you're doing across the globe.
Thank you so much, Andrew. It was a pleasure.
It was a lot of fun.